And now oh, here we are. I think we are officially going live. And just as we went live, my telephone that has my notes just kicked me out, but that's okay. Now we're live. So hello and thank you to everybody who is joining us today. Again, we are going to carry on with our discussion about post-secondary education, the ripple effect that we are seeing across the sector because of a lack of investment and care and love and support for Laurentian and our friends in Sudbury. This time, however, we are shifting the focus. If you didn't see it already, you can always go and grab it. But yesterday, I spoke to some folks from faculty associations locally to us here in Waterloo Region. Today, we are moving to talk about our contract academic staff members and other folks that are in the sector to have the same conversation, but talk about what that ripple effect looks like. So in this particular conversation, I am joined by Tanya Shute, who is from Wilfrid Laurier University, and you are local 912. Is that right? That's the teaching assistant union. Am I right?
Local 902.
902. Yeah, oh, I'm so sorry. Local 902. Newly formed? Okay, we're going to talk about that in a sec, but it's teaching assistants, right?
Right.
Okay, beautiful, because that's really important. We don't often talk about the teaching assistants, and those are students that are, for those that are watching that may not know much about the sector, which is all super cool, it's all about learning. The teaching assistants are often our grad students who are both a student in the institution and also either supporting a faculty member or at times leading their own courses, right? And so the impact of that and some of these changes, it's really, really important for us to have you in this conversation. So thank you so much for joining us. We've got Christina Llewellyn, who's from Renison College at the University of Waterloo, and you are part of Renison's Association for Academic Staff. Is that correct? But tell me what the proper name is, because I know I didn't do that right.
Yeah, the acronym is RAS, and it's the Renison Association of Academic Staff, and we are also fairly newly formed as well. We unionized just over a year ago and have been in existence since 2018.
That's really good. So that makes me want to ask everybody a question. Don't worry, Sandra, I have not forgotten you. But I do want to ask a question about these newly formed unions, because I actually think that is a telling shift for us within the sector. And a lot of the reason why folks have to unionize is because we are seeing the impact of the lack of investment and the kinds of things that our employers may feel compelled to do to keep the boat afloat, as some might say. If you had a boat. I don't have a boat, just in case you're wondering. And Sandra, can you pronounce your last name for me?
Dalpy.
Dalpy? Okay. And so Sandra Dalpy is with us from Wilfrid Laurier University Staff Association, right? And so that is not a newly formed association?
No, it's not, but we certified, I believe, in 1995, I want to say. Mm-hmm. And then we joined OSSTF VISO, so we're a District 35 under them.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to take us a step back to move us forward, which is sometimes what I do. So I'm going to take us a step back because we recently heard about what was happening at Laurentian. Our hearts are with the folks in Sudbury that are impacted. We know that there's a ripple effect. And to be honest, while there's been a lot of attention on faculty jobs that were lost, close to 100 faculty jobs that were lost as they redesigned behind closed doors because of the CCAA process, not because, and I want to be really clear about that, because it wasn't a design within negotiations and bargaining, but it was a process that allowed everybody to subvert the unionized bargaining process that would allow voices to be heard. And in that redesign, the loss of a number of really critical programs happened there. There's been a lot of attention on that, but there are still questions about how many staff members and contract staff members may be lost in this process. So I know that came up yesterday, and so that's a starting point for us. However, we also, in response to this, My office, as the critic for colleges and universities, we've received a number of letters and emails and people demanding that the government save Laurentian. But one that stood out for me was the call from two different unions that have called for the removal of the minister from this post. And so the reason that I wanted to have these public conversations wasn't to just focus on the minister, etc., but for us to speak into being what we need from a minister to ensure that we reverse the longstanding lack of investment in our sector. And so I want to kind of start there. When we hear such an uproar and a cry from the public, and I had a number of academics that have written to me to say that they cannot take him as the minister anymore without being worried, right? Like they've lost trust. But I'm also hearing it from community members who recognize the importance of our post-secondary institutions to our communities, right? When that bubbling happens, what is happening on the ground? Like, that's my starting point for this conversation. So I'm going to start with Sandra. If you can tell me, what is it that you are hearing on the ground? Are you hearing that same call? Like, why do you think this is happening? Let's just throw it over to you.
Okay. Really, we have been discussing it in our executive meetings. I'm a member at large, so I am on the actual WLUSA board. Just worry, again, for how many staff members have also been affected, what this means for us going forward as a university, as an institution that's publicly funded, and the absolute fear that this was done so quickly. And just, I mean, we have things in our collective agreements, financial exigency plans, and they were all ignored. So what does this mean for us going forward as staff members? Because if classes aren't there and students aren't there and faculty aren't there, then the staff aren't there either.
Yeah. Yep. And that was raised again. That was raised yesterday, that a lot of these, I think that there's a myth around what exists in the agreements that we have in our institutions. And there are all sorts of clauses that are in there to allow us all to be at the table so that these decisions are made in a way that protects the workers that are keeping the entire system going. But when you have the government participating in a process that removes us from those decision-making tables, it is fear, it is worry that we're hearing. Christina, are you hearing the same kind of thing? Like, what is it that you're hearing on the ground?
Yeah, I'm hearing incredible concern from staff, from students, and from faculty, as well, actually, from other administrators at colleges and universities. I mean, I think the major big picture concern is that we have a government that does not believe in the investment in public education. Mm-hmm. We have seen that. I researched the area of K-12 education. We have seen that in K-12 education, and we see that also in post-secondary education. This is a major concern that as a government, they do not see this as a social investment in a host of ways, whether it be around issues of equity, whether it be around Indigenous rights, whether it be gender equity and the midwifery program, whether it is around language rights and the Francophone population and their education, but also they don't even see it as an economic investment. Every economic sector will tell you that investing in public education brings back economies, brings back dollars. We're in the middle of a pandemic in which we're seeing the decline in economies, especially those struggling in northern regions, in rural regions. And you have just basically added an incredible additional hurdle over the long term. And so instead of seeing this as a social and economic investment in public education, they're actually seeking to not support, at best would be the kindest interpretation, and to dismantle would be the most critical interpretation.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Christina, because that the need to invest, like in my role, I am often talking about the kinds of things and advocating for things that I think are important investments. And especially right now, right? Like this is all happening in the context of a pandemic, where the government has, for instance, they called a committee on to look at the finance and economic recovery of the province. Very early on, it was during the first wave. So I inserted myself into that committee so that we could talk about what these investments could look like. And post-secondary is such an important investment, but for some reason, it's as though they are not willing or desiring to look at the sector and what it brings to the broader province. Like, what does this mean? And so I want to ask Tanya to also join in on this discussion, but I'm going to add a little twist, because something that you said, Christina, kind of twigged it for me. When we talk about, so there was a shift in the way that the funding formula was going to come out, right? So they have this performance-based funding model that we could have our own little podcast about, because I have feels. But in that model, one of the performance metrics was jobs, right? Like, so there is an irony that they would not provide the investment in Laurentian to save those jobs. And when I think about grad students and the folks that are our TAs, like those are their jobs while they're trying to get themselves ready for other jobs. Are you hearing, like, what are you hearing from the population that you are a part of in terms of the ripple effect or the impact on your own thoughts about being in this system and what it is that you're trying to access and what your sort of your next steps are in your own academic career?
Yeah, I think that the feelings are utter disbelief, right? That people think that this is like a brick and mortar institution that surely is unwavering. And for it to be dismantled so abruptly and in such a crude manner, it's, we already have such precarious jobs as teaching assistants, and the pandemic has only highlighted the bounty that the university would want us to do. And for people that want to climb up that academic ladder, you'd expect that tenured faculty would be the, I've gotten job security finally. So for that, again, to be off the table in a time that is so out of control, it's just that much more precarious and truly unbelievable.
Yeah, and you know what? I think let's take a moment to talk about the precarity of the kind of work that's available in the post-secondary sector, because again, it's like this moment is revealing a lot of things that have been mythically concealed, right? So I can tell you, like, I'm a member of provincial parliament, but my background is in this in post-secondary. And my mummy to this day, well, up until Laurentian, my mummy would call me and say, you need to have a job in the university because that job will secure your space and allow you to ensure that you have what you need for your kids, right? As a single mommy with 3 kids, this is a topic of conversation fairly regular with my family, right? But then Laurentian happened and my mom called me and was like, but how does that even happen, right? And so I think that let's take a minute to talk about the makeup of our institutions. Who are in these jobs? What is happening? Because yesterday, Faculty Association representatives spoke about the fact that there's a huge percentage of the courses that are being taught by contract staff. And I see you all nodding, so I'm going to go back. I'm going to go backwards where I started. So I'm going to start with Tanya. Tell me, Tanya or Tanya? Saying
Tanya?
It's Tanya, right? My best friend when I was in school in Scarborough was Tanya. So I keep doing that, and I'm sorry, but she was lovely. So now you're lovely too. So Tanya, let's start with you. Let's talk about that. Let's delve into the precarity. What does that even look like, and what concerns are floating within the sector?
So we're actually in our first round of collective bargaining as a new unit. And so it's kind of further highlighted some of the issues, specifically around transparency of what can be our job, who is allowed to be a TA. So we had some issues with international students being deprived that opportunity. And as well, knowing that the pandemic has kind of thrown us for a loop, we don't know how many people will be guaranteed TAs going forward, no matter what promises were made. And frankly, it's funding as well. We know that these graduate students who are TAs will likely take longer then, well, firstly, then their degree says they should, which we already know is an issue that people are going at least a year over, but the pandemic's going to further that issue. So it's going to limit the amount of people that are going to be able to continue their degree, who are in the privileged position that are able to get extra funding or self-fund, which isn't how universities should work.
Yeah, and then we're back to this access. So Christina, can I ask you to jump in there and talk to me a bit about this precarity and what's happening in the sector?
Yeah, I think that there's a myth among the public that everyone who is working in post-secondary education are tenured faculty who have, plush jobs of security, and that's how students are taught, and that's how it's fully done, and that's just not the case. Faculty cannot do their work without research assistants, teaching assistants, without staff, and we're a collective community, and we need to stand by one another. But what you see increasingly is attempts at division, and there is a lot of precarity, especially those who are not tenure-track faculty. And when you look at the makeup, and we're talking about when it comes to teaching courses, for example, sessionals, it's often in most universities 50% plus of courses are taught by sessionals. And when they're doing that, they're teaching across different universities. They're developing new courses with very little warning sometimes, very little notice. They're not receiving sometimes the same kind of research supports and teaching supports so that they might be able to transition into a more secure position. And when you look at demographics, although we have really poor race-based data, we do know that it's overwhelmingly those who are racialized and those who are women who are in those precarious ranks. And as you move up into more security, then you're seeing more men and more white men in those positions. And so it is a serious equity issue for our universities and for the quality of education. We need people to have permanent, secure employment with academic freedom, the ability to do research that informs their teaching, as well as teaching that informs their research. And that is a huge source of employment for students as well within the sector, that we actually do have grants that can support students within institutions.
Yeah, it's interesting. The other thing that I would add to the narrative around what is happening on the ground in our institutions is the type of courses. Like if I did not have this job, one of the pieces of research that I would love to do is to look at what the courses are that contract staff are actually teaching. Because one of the things that I've noticed is that they are often teaching the courses that are more critical. No offense to the other courses, but the ones that are sort of on the books and have become mandatory, et cetera, don't necessarily have the critical lens that we need right now. So you'll see contract academic staff members that are the ones that are teaching critical race theory or, within the gendered studies programs and that kind of stuff. And then if they don't get that job for whatever reason, including look at if you're having a lack of investment and they start to decide they're going to cut certain things, it's those critical courses, but those courses remain on the books. And so the university can then sell themselves for this critical lens, but they don't have the people power to teach the things that make them so critical. Right? Not to mention that a lot of those contract academic staff members don't have access to the staff support needed to bolster and do the rest of the work, whether it's to navigate the system for a less precarious job or even just to do the research that would help to enhance that course, right? Like they're on their own at home trying to make magic happen. So Sandra, I'm going to throw it over to you as well and ask the same thing. Talk to me a little bit about what you hear in terms of the precarity of this and potentially even the fear that staff have right now when they see this happening out in Sudbury. And now what if they are staff that are working in one of the programs that was already pretty precarious? I know a couple of years ago, for instance, it continues, but there was a very active attack on women and gender studies programs. Right? Maybe that's very strong, but it's how I feel. It was very active. It was very targeted. It was across the sector, right? So I'm throwing it over to you just to chit chat about the precarity piece.
I've been at Laurier for 22 years. I was in the business faculty, and then I came over to the Faculty of Arts. So I've seen a lot of changes. I have noticed our tenure track positions are very difficult to even get.
Yeah.
We have had, through attrition, we've lost 3 full-time faculty, and more will be leaving us. They're not replaced. And in the place, because we still have the same basic amount of courses, are contract faculty. And I agree, they don't have the resources. When we look at hiring, you know, you're looking at 100 plus people applying for one position. And they have PhDs, they have extensive research, etc. When they come in, they're just mules to teach. You know, there's nothing given to them for research. Very rarely do they get instructional assistants. In fact, it's usually something given to full-time faculty who are teaching in graduate programs. So they would get the assistants at the undergraduate level, kind of as a trade-off. So that's very frightening to me. It's changing the whole lens of what a university is. It's changing the whole tenure system. And I just can't imagine, again, the precarity of the faculty in Sudbury that have lost their positions. How many tenured faculty were they? And how are they ever going to get another job, because the jobs aren't out there?
Well, and then, so that brings us right back to where I want us to have this conversation where I'm meeting with a bunch of different people for these public conversations in different areas in the post-secondary sector. And part of why I'm doing that is because I really truly believe that it is important for us to speak into being what we want to see in terms of investment in the sector. So oftentimes when something as horrifying as what is happening at Laurentian happens, we end up in our little pockets. So, you know, staff is talking to their staff unions or to their colleagues that are staff members, contract academic staff members are talking to their peeps, and students are talking to theirs, but we don't have a public discussion or forum to say, but this is what we need. So what I know is this. I know that for decades, the sector has been underfunded. And from my role prior to this, when I was also at Laurier as the Director of Diversity and Equity, because there is a change in the strategic mandate agreement, so a lot of people that might not be from the sector will hear people talk about SMAs. So the strategic mandate agreements are actually agreements between the university and the province around funding structures. That's my easiest way to explain it. When I was at Laurier, there was a switch in this agreement, and there was an inclusion of diversity and equity as well as student experience. And in that switch, that brought me in my capacity into these discussions around how we sell that kind of work so that the province will invest in us. As my mummy says, I tell you that to tell you this, right? We need proper investment in the sector so that in the Board of Governors area where they are looking over the finances, they don't do things like feel compelled to have entire programs or the majority of a program taught by precarious workers. So that they are in fact able to build on the tenure track positions or the more permanent positions, so that people can know that this institution is doing this work and they are committed to this work, and so they are investing back into these workers. And in order to do that, in my opinion, we need to have a minister who is vocal enough, knowledgeable enough to understand what the problems are in the sector and why that investment wasn't happening, and then advocate to make the change, right? So with that as the backdrop, as we start to wrap up our conversation, I'm going to just go around once more and ask you to share with me, what is it that you would want to see from a minister of colleges and universities that could sort of turn us around and refocus us on real investments that are needed at this time in the sector. So I'm going to start with you, Christina, because you thought that you would never be first because of the way I was doing this, but now you're first. You're number one.
All good. I guess the big ask is that you stop treating universities as private corporations. Universities are public educational institutions and need to be treated as such. And that requires an investment in the social good and collective good that is public education. And that also requires that banks and changing governments with different political ideologies are not the one making decisions for what education looks like in each institution. And within, higher education, we talk about collegial governance. Mm-hmm. The reason collegial governance is so important is that the staff, the students, and the faculty know what is needed for their programs. And they know when something needs to be restructured or something isn't working or how they can restructure that. And they need to be empowered to do so. You can't cut off the kind of funding they need to actually do the work. But so that funding is critical, and you need to support it directly for students as well as for the institutions. Mm-hmm. But you also need to allow for decision making to happen by those who work on the ground. Yeah. So I would just note for people who might be thinking Laurentian is, a one-off situation, that this has everything to do with the most recent announcement about the Northern Ontario School of Medicine, that the government has decided arbitrarily that now it will be an independent institution and not offer degrees related to Lakehead and Laurentian. This has everything to do with the decisions that have been made around the French Ontario University, which received thankfully backlash, and there was some backtracking on that. It has everything to do with the performance funding that could put at risk, $3 billion of funding towards the post-secondary education, because that performance funding is all based on, private sector measures of what good education is. So a complete lack of understanding of how universities and colleges need to run themselves is a real problem here.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that, Christina. I'm going to ask you the same question, Sandra. What do you want to see from a minister? What is the investment that we want to see? Let's talk the sector into being that we actually want.
Well, Christine just said it so well, especially about the funding. The fact is, if it is a publicly funded organization or university, then it should be publicly funded, not the bare minimum, and you have to dance through hoops to get anything extra. Because I see a tendency towards creating programs that will create a buzz, let's put it that way. Yep. Like the things of today. So you get the people, the students coming. It's just a very backwards thing. And I don't know necessarily that just removing the minister will fix the problem. Unless we get someone in there who has the solid background in universities and colleges and knows the true realities, things will not change at all. It's a very scary process that we have people in power that don't know what they're doing.
Well, and you know what, Sandra, that is so important. And it's part of why in this discussion that I'm having over the course of the week, I want us to talk into being what we want from a minister. Because if there is one lesson that I've learned as a new member of provincial parliament, I didn't realize that the government could just decide who is in charge of ministries and that those folks didn't have to know what they were in charge of. Like, I didn't know that was actually a thing, but it's a thing, folks. It's a thing. And we need to do better if we want investments in each of these sectors, right? So I am totally with you. And it's why I want the conversation to be bigger and broader and more bold, right? And so with that, I'm going to ask you the exact same thing, Tanya. What is it that you want to see from a minister who's responsible for fighting for our sector? What is it that you want to see from your vantage point? Because I think it's important to end with the students, man. This is part of, it is so important for you folks to be centered in this. So over to you.
So I think that a couple of words that you used, bold and fight, that kind of encapsulates what I would see as a minister. Right now it is a slippery slope, like Sandra suggested, where we're just going to have more contract faculty and less actual research being able to go on due to the sheer workload they have. So we need a minister that's able to have that strength and that tact to be able to completely pivot us into a different direction, furthering what education, like in its essence, should be, which is the pursuit of knowledge and not the pursuit of money. And that, when they said that, no students would be affected by the Laurentian decision, well, that's categorically not true, right? Mm-hmm. To be able to have your program canceled at any moment, what is that saying to our students that, have spent a lot of their time trying to figure out what they want to do with their life? So we need a minister that has that strength, but also that ability to listen that Christina was talking about, to give some power back to the institutions to be able to make those decisions, but as well to be able to listen to their experts and use that advice to make their decisions.
Listen, I want to say a huge thank you. I wish that we could be in person and I could give real hugs, but we are in a pandemic, so I'm sending you virtual hugs. And saying how grateful I am to each of you for sharing some time and space and energy with me for this important discussion. I'm going to add my own 2 cents because I do really live by this idea of speaking it into being. We need ministers. We need a minister that oversees colleges and universities that recognizes the important role that they play. And part of that is ensuring that there's access to that space. And so the equity lens on everything that is happening in this sector is so hugely important. And in my opinion, it is the minister's responsibility to pay attention to that. So my heart breaks when I think about getting rid of an Indigenous studies program that was created by Indigenous folks for Indigenous folks, and has served to bolster other people's understanding that is non-Indigenous. Like, that should never have been even a thought. The same thing with the Francophone community in Sudbury. The same thing with the midwifery program that we know serves such an important role and service to folks in Northern Ontario. We need real investments, and we need to have an ability to discern what Northern institutions need, which is very different than what a university in our area in Waterloo Region might need, or what would be needed by a university in downtown Toronto. Like, there are other places that we need to consider what is required in that community to help it thrive. So with that, again, thank you all so much. To those that are watching, people are putting in such beautiful comments. Thank you to all of you for even watching and being so good to us. We are going to keep this conversation going. I will have some new special surprise people to talk to again tomorrow, and we're just going to keep the conversation happening in public. If anybody is watching and they have questions or concerns that they also want to raise about what's happening at Laurentian or about what is happening within the sector more generally, you can find me on all social media outlets with my full name, Laura May Lindo. You can send me DMs. You can email my office. Please know that I will use every tool in my toolbox to creatively keep pressure on, and most importantly, to fight for all of you. So have a good one. See you later.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.